our audience for the first podcast that we at Custom Built Homes are running, which really focuses on the delivery of custom and self-build housing nationally. And what we want to cover in this series that we're going to be running is the planning dimension, the land, how land comes forward, local authority activities and practices, as well as delivery models. My name's Mario Wolf. I'm the Director of Planning and Strategic Engagement at Custom Built Homes. And we are an enabler of custom and self-build housing. We work with landowners, strategic land promoters, local authorities, as well as private individuals who want to bring forward larger scale custom and self-build housing. I'm an ex-civil servant and also the former director of the Right to Build task force. Our mission at Custom Built Homes is really to lead the industry from the front and promote custom and self-built housing in the widest possible way. And this first episode really focuses on the planning dimension of the delivery of custom self-built housing, where we really want to unpack some of the elements of delivery. And this is very timely given the recent announcements by the Chancellor of the Spending Review, where they announced £2.2 billion to support a loan finance facility for custom and self-built housing. And I'm delighted to be able to welcome two fantastic guests to our first podcast today, Christopher Young and Andy Moger. Can you both perhaps just introduce yourselves?
Okay, so my name is Christopher Young. I'm a QC or Queen's Counsel practicing in town and country planning at the Planning Bar. And I do predominantly housing schemes. And what I have seen is that when we do planning appeals, the self-build issue is becoming more and more prominent in the general approach to the delivery of housing. And in particular, some of my clients will embrace self-build on speculative applications on non-allocated sites to try and enhance the offer of what they're seeking to deliver. The government is undoubtedly very, very interested in this area. Recent announcements confirm that, and they want to see real growth in this sector, and they're laying all the foundations to make that possible. I often call a witness on this, and that is Andy Moger, who you can see on the screen.
Right. Thank you, Chris. Yes, I'm Associate Director at Tetlow King Planning. My name's Andy Moger. Based in our Bristol head office. We also have a South East office in Kent, and we've got 13 professional planners across the two offices. I'm a planning expert on the Right to Build task force, and I've been giving expert evidence at appeal inquiry on the subject for a number of clients, as Chris mentioned. I also have a range of application experience in this sector, which began with the Homes and Communities Agency's pilot scheme in the heartlands at Trebenton Park in Cornwall. I provide seminars, Ask an Expert area, and exhibit at the Self-Build and Design magazine shows. And Tetlow King Planning are the retained planning consultancy for custom-built homes.
Thank you, Andy. Welcome to you both. It's fantastic to have you with us today. So let's dive straight into the themes that we want to run through. And before we do that, I think I just wanted to set out briefly what we understand the custom-built homes to be self and custom house building, because it's a question that's often asked. And then let's briefly talk about the legal framework which underpins our sector. Essentially, self and custom house building is a form of house building where the homeowner purchases a plot of land to then fund the construction of their home. And by buying the land, they have more control over the design and the build out of their home. And in practice, there's a range of ways in which this can be done, in which people can build their own homes, either on their own or by working with others. It's very unhelpfully often referred to as self-build, particularly by local planning authorities. And that is something that is confusing and sometimes difficult in the context of planning applications and planning decisions. Because self-build typically involves the construction of a single home on an isolated plot, it might be an infill plot, for the construction of a home by an individual, particularly around DIY, or they might manage trades themselves. Now, that can be done individually as well as working with others through sort of community land trust schemes, for example, co-housing projects. Custom build, on the other hand, is the larger scale version of that, where larger scale projects are laid out with service building plots. And then you've got a construction provider or providers who build the homes for individuals to their specific specification. Now, it's very important to recognize this isn't just about detached housing. It can be semi-detached housing. It can be apartments as a start to come through. But the majority at the moment seems to still be focusing on detached housing. But it can also deliver affordable housing as recognized in the National Planning Policy Framework. That's important. We might come back to that a little bit later. And the framework which underpins the growth of our market is the Self and Custom Housebuilding Act 2015, as was amended. And I'd want to give Chris an opportunity to briefly outline what that statutory framework really entails, because it is important for the growth of our sector and sometimes poses some challenges in terms of delivery. Chris.
Yeah, thank you, Mario. So what we have is a legislative requirement for the delivery of self-build and custom-build homes. And this is really important because a lot of areas of housing in this country that are proposed and needed have no statutory footing. This all started because of the interest in this sector, and in particular, the Private Members Bill that was secured by Richard Bacon MP. And he introduced what became the Self-Build and Custom Build Act 2015. It's been amended subsequently, but at the essence of it, the Act doesn't distinguish between self-build and custom build, as you talked about, Mario, but it is about providing individuals and associations and people working for those individuals and associations with the ability to build and complete houses to be occupied by those individuals. So not built by somebody who has no interest in the house at the end, but doesn't need to be built by them, can be designed by them. That's where we get the custom build phrase. Now, in considering whether to provide for this, local authorities must be satisfied that the initial owner will have the primary input in the final design and the layout. Legislation makes that clear. The responsibility for keeping the self-build and custom build register falls to relevant authorities who are effectively the local authority for the area. And that's the primary aspect of this. The legislation requires a register to be kept. And then in terms of that, there's duties on the local authority. First of all, to prepare, maintain, and promote a register of people who are interested in self-build, and so that their names and their details are stored. Secondly, to have regard to the need for self-build housing in the decisions that they're making. And thirdly, a duty to provide sufficient permissioned service plots to meet the demand. So the people who register form the demand, and the demand must be met, which is a really innovative and significant development in the law relating to housing. And Andy knows plenty about that, so I'll hand over to him.
Thank you, Chris. Yes, so the duty effectively provides for a rolling requirement for local authorities to meet demand arising on their self-build register. Something called base periods, and base periods are what the demand is recorded in. So it's helpful, I think, just to briefly explain how base periods work. So the first base period 1, is slightly different to all the other base periods. Base period 1 begins either on the date that the register started or on the 1st of April 2016, whichever of those came first. And thereafter, base periods run from the 31st of October one year to the 30th of October the next. And those dates are slightly different to most monitoring periods that you tend to see with local authorities, and the reason for that is just it's due to when the actual legislation itself was enacted. So rather than running April to March, you typically see it's an October to October monitoring period, and within those base periods, an authority has to record the interest for self-build and custom build, and that's individuals and associations of individuals. So associations of individuals, typically groups of people who are looking to do some form of community or group self-build project. Now, looking at the register itself, local authorities, they're allowed to introduce 2 optional tests for joining the register. And the requirements for this are that in order to do so, that must be justified and proportionate and in response to a recognised local issue. So the two tests themselves are a local connection test. What you tend to see here is local authorities requiring that in order for somebody to join their register, they have to have lived in a local authority area for a particular period of time, worked in it, or have some sort of family connection. And what the local connection test does is it splits the register into two component parts, but we'll come back to that later on in a bit more detail. The second test is financial solvency. This one is slightly less common, I think, because the practicalities of implementing it are a little more difficult for local authorities. But what you tend to see is that authorities require a certain amount of capital to be demonstrated by the applicant before they can enter the self-build register. The other thing that an authority can do is they're allowed to charge fees for entry. There's a wildly differing scale across the country in how this operates. Some authorities choose not to operate a fee, which in my view is the best approach. Some of them charge extortionate fees, hundreds and hundreds of pounds for entry onto the register. So the legislation itself is, of course, supported by secondary regulations, the MPPF and the PPG. The regulations are largely a repetition of the legislation itself, but there is a separate piece of regulation, I think, which is really important, and that's the time for compliance and fees regulations. And what these do is they define the period within which a local authority has to issue sufficient suitable development consents to meet the statutory duty. And what it says is that it's a 3-year period beginning immediately after the end of a base period. So if we looked at base period 1, for example, base period 1 ended on the 30th of October 2016. And what that means is that an authority then has until the 30th of October 2019 to issue sufficient number of consents to meet demand arising from base period 1. So if 50 people joined the register in base period 1, the authority has until 30th of October 2019 to issue 50 suitable development consents in order to have met their statutory duty. So what we've tended to see is that the first right to build day was the 30th of October 2019. This was the first period at which authorities' performance against the statutory duty on a national basis could be measured. And the National Customer Self-Build Association undertook some research, and what it actually showed is that less than half of local authorities had actually met the statutory duties. 45% had achieved it. We had the second right to build day, 30th of October this year. So it's going to be interesting to see the results of the Customer Self-Build Association's survey this year to see whether that's changed, whether it's gone up, whether it's gone down. And I think an important point is that the statutory duty is a numerical exercise rather than locational. And what I mean by that is if, for example, there was 50 people on a base period, 25 of which specified a particular location in the local authority area where they wanted a service plot, the authority is not required to issue 25 suitable consents for that particular location. It's the 50 consents overall that they have to meet. So if we turn to the MPPF itself, we've got paragraph 61, which is requiring local authorities to assess and plan policies, people wishing to commission or build their own homes. And then the PPG, of course, has got an entire section dealing with self and custom house building. So just a couple of particular points to pick up on the PPG is the initial occupier requirement, as Chris mentioned, and also the requirements for secondary data sources for a robust assessment of demand.
And that's quite important, isn't it, to inform particularly local plans, because as we know, local authorities sometimes rely only on the register in terms of their forward planning function. And that's something that is something we are looking at to see how we can make our data more widely available to local authorities in order to inform plan making. Because at the end of the day, we'll come back to this, a strong local plan is the tool to enable more sites to come forward, which is the purpose of the legislation. So thank you for that. So how is this going to, how is this beginning to influence what's coming forward in the market? And certainly from a custom homes perspective, we are seeing an increasing number of inquiries coming in from landowners, also from larger site promoters, and smaller scale opportunities for plots between 5 and 50 homes coming through, and not a week goes by where we don't see an inquiry coming in. Some of those inquiries obviously relate to very speculative development in the countryside, which sometimes are very difficult to be able to justify, but others have got some really good opportunities. And it's about how we convert those opportunities into real homes for people who are wanting to buy the plots. And that's the key challenge, and how we then engage proactively with councils, and also what councils have by way of a policy framework to support the delivery. How are you finding it from your side, Chris and Andy, in terms of the inquiries coming in from a consultancy and also from a barrister's perspective? Have you got any anything to share with us?
So thank you, Mario. So the position is that where local authorities have got a policy that requires, say, 5 or 10% self-build, then developers are accepting that. They've often sought to resist that at the local plan stage, but if it becomes a policy, then they have to just adhere to that. And so they need to investigate how they might deliver that. And then for speculative applications, so those on unallocated sites, as I said earlier, it's a way of enhancing the offer in terms of the material considerations that might outweigh a proposal that is in conflict with the development plan. And what we find is a lot of inspectors, quite understandably, find this a new area. They haven't come across this area. And so they need to understand how the legislation works. They're very keen to hear evidence, even if councils don't contest that evidence. And to identify whether there are shortfalls. But even when there aren't shortfalls against the low figures in the register, inspectors still seem very interested in this. How that translates on the ground isn't really my department, because I'm trying to secure the planning permission for my clients. Andy knows more about that.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, so as Chris said, we are seeing a lot more interest at appeals now. Is forming part of the benefits package. And I think another reason for that is that we've seen decisions now where a significant and even substantial weight has been given to the provision of self-built and custom-built plots. I mean, as a practice, we've had 5 inquiries on this, another 2 on the way, and a hearing programme for the new year. So there's a lot of activity going on in this. And yeah, inspectors are genuinely interested. Whenever have been on the stand, they've always had questions about this, just because it's new information to them. And the same goes for I think for land promoters in the benefits package. And one other one I think that we are seeing is landowners, where they want to retain some sort of control over the land. And typically that goes hand in hand with them wanting to provide a home for themselves and their family. And then the final one I think is neighbourhood plans. And I think it'd be fair to say that sometimes what we're seeing is that this could be almost an acceptable face of development in a neighbourhood plan for local community, particularly where there's some sort of tie to local people for affordability.
That's great, and we'll come back to the planning appeal scenario a little bit later, if I may, because I think it's important we unpack some of that and what some of the lessons are that are coming out of that. And I think our audience will be interested in some of the appeals which are starting to highlight some key themes which might be important to cite in a case. So lots of opportunities coming through the legislative framework. It's having an effect, but to what extent are there some challenges, I think, is something that we want to understand a bit better. So the next section, I wanted just to run through a couple of issues. One is in relation to local authority practices around registers. And you touched on this earlier. To what extent are they using the register potentially to the best effect? And then move on to local plans and the role that permissions can play to actually gain a consent. So Andy, can you just talk a little bit about what your experience is on registers? You've borne some of the scars already, haven't you, in terms of how you justify it? So
I have, yes. Thank you, Mario. So, of course, the important, I think, thing to note with registers is there only one element of assessing demand. We know that PPG is requiring a robust assessment using the secondary data sources, and really the role of a register is to show what some of the level of demand is in an area, and it gives a measure by which the statutory duty, the performance against it can actually be measured. But what we are seeing is a lot of gaming of the system. So register reviews, large numbers of people are removed from base periods. Using GDPR as an excuse is one I often see. Overly onerous fees, I mentioned that earlier. That's a pretty effective way of discouraging entry, where somebody's being asked to pay hundreds of pounds to join a register. And then the local connection test. So as I mentioned, local connection test, the introduction of that splits the register into two parts, part 1 and part 2. And the significance of that is that part 1 is the only part to which the statutory duty applies. Part 2 can't be completely ignored. It still remains a material consideration, but the legal duty does not apply to part 2. And so the benefit for a local authority in doing that is that when they apply a local connection test, what tends to happen is that the numbers in part 1 dramatically reduce. And so therefore their liability, if you like, to meet the statutory duty is also significantly reduced. It makes things easier for them. The financial solvency tests, where you've got an authority, some authorities asking things like a mortgage in principle agreement in order to join a register. I mean, you've really got to question the likelihood of achieving a mortgage in principle agreement before you've even found a plot. I mean, it's just not going to happen. And so we've tended to see this where there's large numbers on register in the early base period years, and the local authority's reaction to that is to reduce numbers by applying a number of those aforementioned tactics. And in some instances, we've seen them applying it retrospectively. So looking at kind of how counting supply to meet the duty, again, what we see there is more gaming of the system, unfortunately. A lot of authorities are counting all single dwelling permissions towards meeting the duty. And in some instances, we're even seeing them counting sites of up to nine dwellings. I mean, you know, in these instances, there's no legal agreement or condition securing a self-build. So you really have to question, you know, how likely it is that those are going to be self or custom built homes. And the reason we see that is due to one particular word in the legislation, and that's the use of the word could. So what the legislation actually says is development permission is suitable if it is permission in respect of development that could include custom or self-build. And so that's the very narrow line that local authorities fall back on and say, well, potentially any of those could be a self or custom built plot. But what they seem to do is ignore the other part of the legislation, which says in terms of the definition of custom and self-build, it does not include the building of a house on a plot acquired from a person who builds the house wholly or mainly to plans or specifications decided or offered by that person. So this comes back to the point of the initial occupier having primary design input. And clearly where you've got a permission for a full planning permission for 9 units, then the initial occupier is going to have no say whatsoever in the design of that particular dwelling.
And that's an important test, isn't it, that you've just outlined? And I think there's a question as to whether the local authorities could be clearer in their own minds about how they apply that legislation in the local context. And certainly what we've seen is supplementary planning documents being prepared to articulate more clearly what the authority does decide to accept under the legislation and what it doesn't. So that's a good outline of the local authority practices. But what about local plans? Chris, in terms of the importance of the local plan in the decision-making process, what's your view on that? You know, particularly around the presumption and the silence of a plan in relation to custom self-built housing policy?
Okay, so very important question from a planning perspective, Mario, is obviously how are decisions made? Well, they're made on the basis of the statutory test, which is that decisions should be made in accordance with the development plan, unless material considerations indicate otherwise. And that's all very well for saying how many houses might be required or having housing allocations and saying that meets the requirements of the council. But self-build has and remains something of a blind spot for a lot of local authorities. So many of them don't have any policies supporting self-build, or if they do have policies, they haven't engaged in the difficult task of allocating sites to meet the needs that are identified even on their own register. So we have a situation in which local authorities often don't have a relevant policy. And under the presumption in favour of sustainable development, which is really a presumption in favour of development if a local authority doesn't have a plan which is up to date using the right housing requirement numbers, or if it doesn't have relevant policies addressing an important area of need. And that last one is critical to demonstrating that if a local authority hasn't got a policy encouraging and allocating land for self-build, then their development plan will be seen as inadequate, and there will be a presumption in favour of the proposal. Now, that was the conclusion of an inspector in an important appeal decision in Droitwich, in Wychavon, in Worcestershire, just around the corner from my mother's house, as it happens. I wasn't involved in that one, but an important, really important decision, because the inspector adopted that interpretation. Nothing in the Wychavon local plan, which I happen to do, and I happen to know about it. I acted for the authorities in South Worcestershire, but that was about 4 or 5 years ago. So self-build was not on the agenda at the time they produced their plan. And with the absence of a policy, the inspector said, well, I'm going to treat the plan as inadequate. I'm going to apply the presumption, and the presumption means that the adverse impacts of the development must significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits, and the benefits obviously being the housing that was delivered. So Andy can speak some more about that case, but that's a really important decision. I should say there are court cases that suggest that isn't the way you interpret it, but I personally, and I'm not alone, think the court cases are wrong and the planning inspector got it right.
Great. Andy, we'll come back to the themes coming from appeals in a few minutes, because I wanted to, before that, just get a sense from you what you see as good and bad practices in terms of local plans, because we are seeing a broad range of different forms of planning policies coming forward. Some are, in my view, shocking, and some are very, very good in terms of what they're doing. So what do you think are sort of the 2 or 3 key points to make in terms of good and bad?
So I think, Mario, that for me, I've seen 4 main policy approaches. So the first is what we would call a package approach. And a package approach, it really ticks all the boxes. It tries to do as broad a spectrum of strategy for delivery of self and custom built plots as possible. And so what it would do is there'll be specific allocations for serviced plots. There'll also be some sort of percentage requirement. So that's typically 5 to 10% on sites of, say, 50 or 100 units. There'll be a housing mix type policy, which covers off the smaller sites. So smaller sites that don't meet that threshold will still have to make some allowance for self and custom build housing to meet some more localized demand. And so really that's why we call the package approach. It covers all the bases. The second approach you tend to see is allocations and or the percentage requirement type policies on larger sites. The third one then we start to see is sort of what we call sort of a vague housing mix type policy, which really doesn't tend to deliver anything. So you may see a policy that says something like self and custom house building will be supported provided that it meets all other policies of the plan. I mean, it's a policy that just says nothing, that does nothing. Yeah. And then the fourth and final one, of course, is no policy, as Chris mentioned. And what that does is it leaves an authority very vulnerable to appeals and speculative applications.
So there's some really good points there on good and bad that we need to be aware of, both as policymakers as well as applicants, to pursue our objectives, really. Chris, have you got any views on the percentage policy particularly? I mean, you deal with large landowners and land promoters, and what's your insight into that? I mean, I think there's some nervousness out there in terms of the incorporation of custom self-built parcels within larger schemes because of the percentage policy.
Yeah, there's definitely some resistance to that, and one can have a degree of sympathy with these builders. The competition for land is very, very intense, and because of that, people think sometimes it's rigged or there's land banking. It's the exact opposite. There is a really fierce competition for land in this country, which means people compete in the bidding for the land, which means that when they deliver the scheme, it has to match up to what they bid for the land. So house builders know what they want to do on the site. If they're then told they have to have self-build, they worry about that. Now, they can sell the plots for good value. And so there's nothing to really worry about financially. But look at it from the house builder's point of view. You're building a housing development, maybe 200 houses, and you're going to be worried that the self-build plots will not be completed, and they'll be opposite some of your market housing or affordable housing. And, some people joke about this, but it looked like a half-finished family housing proposal on a Greek island where, often they take a generation to build the house. So those concerns are there. My own opinion is councils should face up to this, and they should face up to the need for self-build and find suitable sites so that the house builders aren't left worrying about this. What causes them to worry then causes them to submit objections to the policy, which is totally counterproductive. Nobody is suggesting this is going to replace volume house building. It won't. But as an area of additional housing, it's to be encouraged. So councils should promote sites to meet self-build, which are not just a tag-on to a major housing site or a site for 200 homes, and stop the antipathy towards them that many in the house building industry have, but to see them as something that needs their own sites, as indeed we need more extra care. And that doesn't need to be a threat to house building, but councils need to just allocate enough sites. And that's the problem, in my view. We just don't have enough politicians brave enough to allocate enough sites. They think the answer to this is just to stick it as a tail end on another site.
And yes, and so certainly from our experience, that's certainly what's happening, is councils look to the larger sites to absorb the level of demand which they might or might not have identified, and look to the larger house builders to accommodate this, where the opportunities might be on a whole range of sites. Let's not forget, it's government policy that local authorities should be identifying smaller sites. And that's important. And there's a role that custom and self-build can play for to accommodate that development on those smaller sites. But we are fairly comfortable that some of our business models can be accommodated easily on larger house building sites. And in fact, we have got some house builders and land promoters that are coming to us saying, can we include a custom and self-build parcel on that? The key question is what form that takes. And it doesn't have to be a DIY offer and simply selling service building plots. It can be a customizable housing offer, and it can be a design and build contract offer where the individuals get a design and build contract as part of the purchase of the plots. So the business models are there. The question is how you take advantage of them to meet your own objectives on the site, to get the site built out with a mix that's the most appropriate to meet policy. I was interested, Chris, you mentioned earlier the point about winning permissions. And can you just say a little bit more about that? Because it does have a role, doesn't it, to help the strength of an application on a larger site, notwithstanding the percentage challenge. It can actually put an application in a stronger position.
Yeah, so my interest in this started when I was engaged in a whole series of appeals in neighbourhood plan areas, and the Secretary of State was recovering these appeals for schemes as small as 10 houses. Initially, there was a recovery criteria for any housing scheme in which there was a proposal for 10 or more houses in an area which had a neighbourhood plan or had a neighbourhood plan proposed. And there are around 2,000 to 3,000 of those now across the country, generally being used for the purpose of restricting and stopping development. And I thought to myself, how can we demonstrate that a proposal is more local than the neighbourhood plan, sort of outdoing localism when it was being used to block suitable housing sites? And I studied the housing white paper that came out in 2017 and ministerial statements before that, all of which promoted the idea of self-build, because ministers look across to places like Austria, where 80% of the houses are built. They look across to Australia, where most people design their own houses through custom build. And they I persuaded a number of clients with very difficult sites in the sense that they were likely to be recovered and refused by the Secretary of State to include some self-build housing on there. And then we found the inspectors very, very receptive to that at the inquiry. And then for a scheme in Lydney, which was the first example, Lydney in the Forest of Dean in Gloucestershire, the inspectors recommended permission enthusiastically. Secretary of State refused it the first time round. We got that quashed in the High Court because it was unlawful. And second time around, the Secretary of State accepted it. So quite a challenging environment, not for the self-builder, but for the developer and the land promoter to deal that. But a way of demonstrating your proposal fits in, as Andy said, really with local aspirations for those who are prepared to see neighbourhood plans as more than NIMBY plans trying to stop development. And I'm afraid a lot of neighbourhood plans are like that, but not all of them. And there's definitely a role for this type of development within neighbourhood plans because they're about local community desires, and there is a huge untapped reserve there of people who want to build or want to design their own homes.
And you're nodding on that, and I think I would agree with that. Do you have any views on neighbourhood plans? They do definitely have a role to help with the local authorities' duty. I think it's important to be clear that duty falls on local authorities, but they have a role in terms of helping to promote neighbourhood plans. So there's a definite role for neighbourhood plans in that mix too.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think the point about affordability as well. The MPPF Annex 2 affordable housing definition is much broader now, and I think there's often this kind of group of people who fall between being able to access the housing register and being able to afford a home on the open market, and that's what products like discount market sales and starter homes are intended to address, and that's, I think, the sort of thing that you often see in neighbourhood plan areas is that they want affordable homes to buy for local people. They're seeing their children leave because they can't afford to live in the parish or town because the house prices is just unaffordable for them. And these sort of products, you can make these sort of products through self and custom build sites. So for example, you could have start homes with a design and build package, or you could have discount market sale plots for people to be able to design and build their own home on that plot.
Very good, very good. I think there's some big points in that. Let's just come back briefly to the appeals. And Chris mentioned one or two, and I think you've alluded to them. And I'm interested in what you think, Andy, in terms of 2 or 3 key themes coming through the appeals. We are seeing some really positive appeals coming forward by the inspectorate, and I think you will be shortly involved in some training in your role as part of the task force with inspectors. What's your take on appeal themes emerging? 2 or 3 sort of key themes.
I think Mary, what would be helpful is just to look at a couple of appeals and then look at some of the themes that are coming out as a wider picture. So we start with one of the most recent ones. This was a Pear Tree Lane Chorley decision for Gladman, and in this particular appeal decision, the local authority had actually met the statutory duty, but that was based on very low numbers. It was 9 across the 5 base periods. But they had an emerging plan with a housing market assessment, which actually showed that demand was far higher than that. And my proof of evidence and assessment also reflected that the numbers were far greater. And yes, there it is there. And this was using the secondary data sources from the PPG to undertake a robust assessment of demand. So supplementing the register with sources such as building plot search websites, such as BuildStore, need a plot information, and information from local estate agents. And the wording of the PPG, what's important is it says such as, so it's not limited to those 3 sources. There are other sources you can look at outside of those. So what we also did in this was to look at the 5-year housing land supply analysis and the likelihood of plots coming forward, and we're able to illustrate actually that it's going to fall well short of this demand that we're identifying. And what was important here was the inspector recognised that actually the self-build applications aren't a reliable proxy for counting of permissions, because the research we did showed that actually only 1/3 of those who were showing an intention to apply for it were converting through to the Form 7 Part 2 stage, and that's the stage where you actually provide evidence you are a self-builder. It's a self-certification process up until that point. And so this was a 10% offer, and the inspector decided that merited significant weight in the planning balance. The other one I wanted to look at just very briefly is at Woodville. Northwest Leicestershire. This was a really important one because the local authority were counting all single dwelling permissions, and the appellant challenged that. And the inspector took the view that there was no evidence that the local authority had any of these secured in a way that met the legal definition in the Act, and therefore none of those should be counted. And what this did is it provided some clarity on the monitoring approach, which is actually absent from the legislation itself. And what's really good here as well is the inspector recognises substantial social benefits in meeting the needs of local residents, but there's also substantial economic benefits. So local builders, employment and training, and it is not purely limited to social. There are other factors in play here. Chris mentioned earlier the Droitwich Spa Newland Lane decision. Again, this is one where the appellant was arguing the statutory duties not met. And the inspector actually found the evidence by the council was not reliable enough to actually conclude that duty was met. And again, this picked up on the SIL point, because what the inspector was saying was you can't just rely on the exemption forms. You need to delve deeper into it. There needs to be more analysis of this. And so he found the duty wasn't met. The authority had a 5-year housing land supply in this instance, but no specific policy. And what was interesting here was that the inspector recognised that the MPPF and the PPG actually attach great importance to this. It's not simply a component of market housing, which is what the council argued, and hence the tilted balance was engaged, as Chris mentioned. And here the inspector recognised this as a significant social benefit, and again gave substantial weight in the planning balance. So in terms of kind of the key points I think we're seeing, the first is that the duty is actually on local authorities to prove or evidence that the duty has been met, not the other way around.
And that's just to pause it, and that is a very, very important point, isn't it? Because we often see local authorities saying it hasn't been evidenced by the applicant as to whether the numbers are justified. So it's a big point.
Absolutely. We're also seeing that supply that reduces shortfall in subsequent base periods can weigh heavily in favour of a scheme. And another point is that supply of plots is cumulative. And what I mean by that is that if a local authority fails to meet its duty in one base period, we don't just forget about that base period. It's carried forward to the next one. And so if they fail again, it keeps on carrying forward until that duty is met. As I've identified in a couple of those that I've cited, there's the fact that they can't rely on the SIL self-build exemption as a proxy for permissions. That there can be a material consideration where the social and economic benefits merit substantial weight in the planning balance. As we know, 5-year housing land supply is not a ceiling, and authorities can't rely on windfall in the future to address a current shortfall in delivery of plots. We know registers can underestimate demand. There's relatively low awareness. And we also know the PPG recommends robust assessment using other data sources such as BuildStore. We know absence of policy is a material consideration, and the tilted balance can be engaged. And then the final point, I think, is that this is a really important one as well, is that delivery needs to be secured in such a way that ensures it's delivered as self-build and custom build in line with the provisions of the Act. So a unilateral undertaking or 106 is absolutely critical to this, because failure to do that means that you aren't actually securing it as the means it's intended in the Act, and so you need to give the inspector security that is what's going to happen.
Chris, you're nodding. Anything else that you can sort of opine on in that context?
Yes, so very briefly, I mean, I completely agree with everything that Andy has said there. He deals with that comprehensively, and I have felt that this is an area that needs a separate individual witness, as I do about affordable housing. Lots of people know about that. And if you're going to have some self-build, then, the planning consultant who deals with the case has enough to deal with the development plan and material considerations. So to really emphasize the value of this, call a separate witness, produce a proof like the ones that Andy has produced. And as we said, inspectors seem very, very interested in this, but you need to know how to navigate it. And in particular, you need to know how to deal with the Section 106 or unilateral undertaking in a way that ensures that the inspector feels, right, well, this is what it will happen. It's not a Trojan horse for some other form of development or I'm having the wall pulled over my eyes. This is actually what's going to happen. Because there's no doubt, I don't imagine there's a single inspector who doesn't think this is a good thing. And it's helped on a number of schemes. So we did a scheme, Andy's mentioned most of them, but another one where Andy's given evidence is Tetlow in Uttlesford. And the site was in what's called a countryside protection zone around Stansted Airport, which is really a pseudo greenbelt policy by another name. Very, very strict. We're in a very narrow bit of the gap between Tetlow and the edge of the airport. Quite a challenging proposal, to say the least. But part of the package, as well as having green infrastructure, was to have some self-build, and the inspector attached great weight to that. She said that weighed heavily in favour of the proposal, even though it was just 10% of all the housing. Other schemes, substantial weight has been given to the self-build, and so it really does enhance the offer if you're dealing with a speculative proposal.
Thanks, Chris. That's really helpful. So let's move on and let's look ahead in terms of what we might be expecting further to strengthen this framework. And what I wanted to do in order to set that in context for our audience is to share something that we've prepared recently, a timeline in terms of the evolution of the legislation. Because we are very clear, and certainly with my insight in government, having previously worked in this area of policy, I'm under no illusions whatsoever that this is not the end of the road in terms of the development of the policy. So I wanted to share with our viewers the slide. Great. So this broadly sets out above the line between 2008 and 2025, the evolution of the right to build policy. Let's call it the right to build in the context of the Self and Custom Housebuilding Act, but it comprises a number of different components. And the genesis of it was really around 2010 when the Conservative Party produced its Conservative Party Green Paper, if you remember that, Chris and Andy. And that set out a future fairly strong direction in terms of bottom-up policy making and planning. And Grant Shapps was the housing minister at the time, and he was very much in favour of including custom self-build into the government's policy. So you had effectively that in broad indications set out in the Green Paper, which made its way into the Conservative Party manifesto, which sought to implement the Green Paper hook, line and sinker effectively in terms of the planning reforms. And very quickly, and I was working with Grant Shapps at the time, we spoke to the sector, and Grant was very clear that we needed an action plan which set out what needed to be done in order to put custom self-built housing on the map. If you look below the line, you'll see there's a government industry housing action plan in 2011, which then informed the preparation of the housing strategy for England, which set out a comprehensive policy approach to what we called custom build at the time. Ministers wanted to get away from the stigmatized self-build term to really put this sector on a sustainable footing, which then made its way into the first NPPF, paragraph 15159. And that morphed into and evolved through a community infrastructure levy exemption, which was introduced in 2014. Nick Bowles was the planning minister at the time, parliamentary undersecretary of state, and he was very keen to support custom and self-build housing. That was in turn supported by some funding which government made available through the Homes and Communities Agency for the preparation of building plots. Some vanguards were created by local authorities to come forward to really test out some of the ideas around the legislation, which at that stage Richard Bacon MP was putting forward by way of a statutory framework. And that made its way into the legislation which you've referred to earlier, Chris, the Self-Build and Custom Housebuilding Act in 2015. Which was subsequently amended by the Housing and Planning Act and the duties that you set out earlier, and then the regulations, which Andy, you pointed to. But it didn't end there. It moved on in terms of guidance being issued through the PPG, Homes England introducing some policy and commitment to support custom and self-build housing through a home building fund. Government supported the task force, which is when I was asked to by Sajid Javid, the Secretary of State at the time, to lead the preparation of a task force and then to bring that forward to help work with local authorities, implement the legislation and work with landowners and strategic land promoters. But that made its way into the white paper in terms of setting out a future direction of this policy and a strong government commitment to support financing of mortgages as well, which led to the revision of the MPPF, paragraph 61, consolidated the 50 and 59, and then moved towards the planning white paper proposals that we've now got. So I just wanted to come back to that in a moment or so. But the Conservative Party manifesto at the last election committed to bringing forward the Help to Buy extension, which, as I referred to at the outset, has now been announced as part of the spending review. So there's a strong commitment there to bring forward further policy to strengthen the availability of land, the framework around land, but not just about land, also helping consumers. But I'm very clear that this isn't ending because we have got the planning reforms to be implemented, and the new planning reforms do set out a fairly strong pointer towards supporting custom and self-build in terms of growth areas being identified, allocating more land for custom and self-build, and supporting the diversification of the housing market. We've also got Homes England, which is working to evolve its developer partner panel and introducing a framework there to ensure that you've got custom and self-build enablers and developers on the panel to work with larger developers when strategic sites come forward. So very, very positive in terms of development. We are expecting any day now some revisions to the PPG, aren't we, Andy, from the ministry, which will, we expect, tighten further the interpretation around the legislation and the policy, which I'm hopeful will help to iron out some of the questions which we currently have. So I hope that viewers will find that helpful in terms of an overview. And I'll be saying a bit more about that in a blog, which I'll be writing on our website in due course. In terms of the legislative changes, Chris, have you got some insight or thoughts on what you think in terms of opportunities that might create as we evolve our policy? And obviously, we've got some blemishes in the legislation as well. What do you see in terms of opportunities and some of the holes in the legislation?
Well, just to start with, I think that graph is really helpful, that timeline. And also, I think, although it's obviously dominated by various pronouncements by the Conservatives, that's because they've been in power or power sharing or almost in power without control for the last decade. And actually, the issue is apolitical. I don't think any party has any opposition to this. I think they see it as a beneficial thing. So it's an apolitical issue, which is obviously then means it's always going to continue to be there. I also think that it's important to recognise what the government is proposing in the white paper, because the white paper is moving to a system which has been called zoning, probably isn't zoning as it is elsewhere in the world, but large growth areas where there are codes to identify what should be developed. Now, I have a brother who lives in Australia. He is, in fact, an Australian citizen, complete with the accent now. And he explains to me how it works there. And they have areas. He lives in rural Western Australia, and it's an R20. That means they can have 20 houses on a hectare of land. In Perth, much more urbanised, and they have areas like R85, 85 units on a hectare of land. The point being that once that is identified as an area to be developed, with plots, 25 plots on the land, that and a code that says how the building line should look, how high the building should be, it makes it a lot easier for individuals to secure planning permission, if indeed that's what they need, rather than the very sophisticated and often very expensive process we have now. So I think the government's white paper proposals are partly about encouraging the development of this sector. And I think that's just inevitably what's going to happen. Huge opportunity for this area to develop. And for custom build, which is really what happens in Australia more than self-build, custom build will grow alongside, the volume house builders, because let's be honest, a lot of land is already optioned and is in the hands of developers who want to develop and house builders who want to develop. But there's definitely a move towards encouraging a simplified planning system, allowing people to custom build on a much bigger scale.
Thank you, Chris. And simplicity and transparency, I think, are the key themes in some of those proposals. And I think that's important to highlight. And the white paper is encouragingly positive towards custom and self-build and the role that it can play in bringing forward land. Because ultimately, it is about the diversification of our market in giving consumers greater choice. And the focus of the right to build has always been about a consumer-led opportunity to unlock land supply, to access land, which is more difficult to do when you're on your own looking to build your own home. Andy, I'll ask you to comment in a minute or two on the planning reforms. But before I do that, I wanted to ask Chris to just give a view on some of the blemishes in the legislation, if I can describe them as that, in terms of, there is an opportunity for a planning bill to come through as part of the planning reforms. And in that bill, you could have an amendment provision which adjusts the Self and Custom Housebuilding Act and its amendments further to address some of those challenges that we've identified. What do you think are sort of 2 or 3 key points which policymakers, legislators might want to look at?
Well, the first one is the one that Andy mentioned before, which is get rid of the word could, because that is not helpful. It makes it much more ambiguous, and it doesn't need to be there. Local authorities should meet this by virtue of delivering, ensuring these units are delivered. The second thing is, I think the whole issue around fees is a fiasco. I don't think there should be any fees charged for this type of register and being on the register. And as we see, completely open to abuse by those authorities who are trying to restrict housing in every possible way. And they are out there. They don't produce local plans. Castle Point, Wirral, I'm shaming them, but, they need to be shamed. They don't want local plans, particularly in greenbelt areas where they think appeals won't be successful. So the fees need to go. And the other thing that I would say is that local authorities are being very unhelpful in suggesting that, developments in back gardens, which are nothing to do with something that somebody has designed or sought to custom build, is part of meeting their requirement. And I think really the answer there is for the PPG to be updated and to make it very clear, because we're having these disputes at inquiries where, Andy's very presence and his knowledge and working on the task force is about delivering this product through planning permissions, and we're being suggested, this is all just a ruse, and it's not really intended for that purpose. So local authorities need to get, they're suspicious of developers. We know that. That's just the way the system works. But I think the truth is that some clear guidance from government would get rid of that needless, frankly, and pointless argument about whether this is really self-build.
Andy, and I think I would point out to what probably one more hole that certainly I've been aware of for some time, and that is around the lack of a sanction within the legislation. What's your thoughts on that? Because it is fairly silent on a stick, isn't it?
Yeah, there's 3 points I was going to pick up on, that was going to be one of them. Yeah, the lack of a carrot or stick, really, for authority. There's no reward for meeting their statutory duty. There's no punishment for failing to meet it. So, as things stand, really, the sector will continue to just be led by appeals, because there is nothing in the legislation really that deals with that. I think, really the key is the tightening up of monitoring what can be counted, because that, in some respects, starts to deal with some of the issues around the duty, whether it's the gaming of the system, and also we talked about SIL quite a lot actually, and the clarity around that. What I see a lot of local authorities do is, even where they do count SIL Form 7 Part 2, that's not a permission or a permission in principle, and the legislation is clear that you can only count a permission or a permission in principle. And so some clarity on points like that, where there's almost some sort of between the various parts of legislation, they don't always speak to each other particularly well. So the self-build exemption, yes, they may be a self-builder, but it may be that they've purchased the plot from somebody and they've had no design input whatsoever. So the various layers don't always fit together particularly well.
So there's a real opportunity there to look at some of those holes, and obviously government has recently announced that it would look to review the legislation, and that was set out in the white paper, that indication as well. If the legislation isn't working, government would look to review. So I think it's important that policymakers and our political masters do look at this very carefully, and I hope you guys will be able to help with some of shedding the light on where some of those changes could be made. And I think you're talking to the National Custom and Self-Build Association at the moment to see how you potentially can help. And I think that's important. We need to bring some of those challenges to bear and understand how they could be mitigated. And we've got the potential also to make further changes through the planning policy framework to support the legislation. It's very clear in the planning reforms, isn't it, Chris, that there would be some changes to the NPPF to help to deliver that. So could there, for example, be, Chris, a target in the NPPF to support custom self-build, maybe, or even to link it to a presumption to under-delivery?
Yeah, I mean, I think the interpretation of the presumption that the inspector in the Droitwich appeal decision, Newlands Road, Droitwich, was absolutely the right one. And had that been challenged, I think it could have been easily defended in court. If there isn't a self-build policy, then the plan isn't doing what it should do. And we've had the Self-Build and Custom Build Act for 5 years now. So how could local authorities not think that was relevant? And I also think that as part of the process, government should be much braver about setting targets. We are going to see with the planning white paper proposals to have housing requirements no longer determined by local authorities and have years of discussion. Central government, which is elected, will hand out the number to each authority. And what they could do within that is talk about having 10% of that total as self-build on self-build sites. Now, house builders, volume house builders need not worry. The numbers are all going up. We need to build, millions more homes. But a component of that is self-build and custom build. And local authorities could be required to deliver 10% of their homes in that category.
That's really powerful and some really good thinking there, which I'm sure MHCLG are alive to in terms of the role that the NPPF can play. Andy, do you have any sort of final observations on the planning reforms that are set out in the white paper and how they could be supporting custom and self-build? There's a lot in there, but clearly there are some opportunities, aren't there?
Yeah, I think sub areas in growth areas specifically for self and custom build, it could really be a game changer. Authorities being required to set aside areas for this particular tenure of housing, it really overcomes that resistance that we're currently faced with from some authorities. Where through this they're being required to make provision on a much larger scale, and what it does as well is it starts to deal with the lack of available land that is holding the sector back to some degree, and that was something that was identified back in the 2011 housing strategy. It brings it a bit more into the mainstream. So if you've got locations all across the country seeing sub areas spring up, it's exciting new homes designed to meet people's individual needs, then I think really interest and acceptance of the sector starts to grow. I think one of the things we did touch on a little bit earlier about exceptions sites and affordable housing. So I think that there are a lot of opportunities here for exceptions to be explored. So as I mentioned, the broader definitions of affordable housing in the NPPF Annex 2. And of course, we've got the paragraph 71 entry-level exceptions for affordable housing. And there's no reason why these couldn't be affordable self-build plots, starter homes through design and build contract, or first homes when we get more detail on that, or discount market sale plots where people can then build a home that suits their individual needs. And then, of course, then that discount is passed on because it's secured in perpetuity. I think demand is there to be met. It's about the right product at the right price, it really in the right location.
And that's very important, isn't it? The demand is definitely there. We are seeing as a company, certainly the Build Store Group data on demand, we've got over 100,000 people vetted looking for building plots right now. And in all local authorities that we are looking at, our demand figures dwarf the numbers on the register. And we know why that is, and that's because the register isn't effectively promoted. There's a handful of local authorities who actively promote it. And we know, I think the stats from the sector indicate 8 out of 10 people just are not aware of the register. So they just cannot be a good indicator for long-term plan making demand. That's certainly our view. And we hope government will recognize that when they ask local authorities to plan for the future of these areas. Gents, thank you very much for your input. We've run out of time, unfortunately. I could talk all day about this and pick your brains. Unfortunately, we don't have the opportunity to do that. There will be an opportunity for listeners to send in some questions to us. We will be posting this on our website, and we will also be making it more widely available through our media channels. We hope you find it interesting to listen to. And of course, we will have a few others coming up in the new year as we go forward. I do want to give a plug for Chris's Have We Got Planning News for You? I think that's the title, Chris, coming up on the 10th of December, where we've got what I would describe as the architect of the Self and Custom House Building Act, Richard Bacon, MP. I've worked very closely with him. He'll be a really exciting guest, and he'll provide a good insight into his thinking around this policy area to drive this policy forward. This is not the end of the road. This creates some really good opportunities for consumers as well as developers and land promoters. And I think that's how we harness that. So thank you very much, both of you, for joining me today. And we look forward to engaging with you further as we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.